This is the new Volvo EX30, which will be arriving in our market very soon and slotting underneath the XC40 and C40. Like those cars, or specifically the C40, this is also an all-electric vehicle with decent range, a choice between rear-wheel drive or all-wheel drive, and what they're claiming to be the fastest Volvo in history. We get an exclusive look at this car before launch, and we've taken it out for a drive all the way up here to gorgeous, sunny Janda Baik to see what this car is all about. My name is AIMAN ABDULLAH, this is Malaysian Motoring, and this is our preview drive of the new Volvo EX30. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the EX30 is now the most compact Volvo available in the lineup, or at least it will be once it launches. Now, the EX30, again, will slot in underneath the C40, which means that dimensionally, this car has to be smaller, which it is. Now, although this car isn't very large, Volvo is very keen to point out that they are surprisingly practical, which is why they arranged for us to do a little bit of a IKEA supermarket sweep challenge where we had to stuff 2,000 ringgits worth of stuff into the back of one of these, and I can say that we did rather well. And there was still some space to spare at that. So clearly, size isn't everything. Anyway. But more importantly, because this car is meant to appeal to a slightly younger audience, that's why the design of this has also been reworked quite significantly. I understand that the car is still camel wrapped, which means some of these details may not be overtly visible to the camera, but the design language for the EX30 follows in line with what we've seen from the EX90. So for example, we have newly redesigned Thor's Hammer daytime running lights, and the overall signature is now more in line with the EX90, although admittedly it doesn't do the little split to reveal the headlights because those live in a permanent position up here. Down the side on these all-wheel drive models, we have 19-inch alloy wheels wrapped in Goodyear Efficient Grip EV tyres, which are not only decent performers but also pretty good at keeping rolling resistance down in order to improve range. As we move further down the side, we still have nice physical, always available door handles, which is always nice because, you know, the motorized ones might break. And overall, I think that the profile of this car looks pretty good. One of the standout features for me in terms of design is the frameless rear view mirrors, which we first saw on Polestar cars, and they're now making their debut on Volvos, which I appreciate hugely. And the rear end design of this car is again very reminiscent of what we saw initially from the EX90, which is why you get the new split taillight design with a vertical element here as well as a C-shaped element down here, which bleeds into the tailgate again in a design that's very reminiscent of Polestar. Now, this particular car is a little bit dirty because we have covered about 8 hours worth of driving yesterday, although Janda Baik isn't that far, so you can imagine the various different routes we had to traverse. Now, opening the tailgate, you will find under 400 litres worth of space. If I'm not mistaken, it's about 358 or something to that effect. Now, this rear end is certainly large enough for 5 people's worth of luggage, or 4 people if they pack the way I do, but at least there is also a false floor, which means that you can actually lower the boot level a little bit more if you want to maximize cargo room. On top of that, the rear seats can also be folded 60/40 in order to further maximize that space, which is what we did yesterday in order to fit all of our IKEA shopping in here. So it's quite clear that this is a very intelligently packaged vehicle. But that does come at some degree of compromise inside. Now, I say that because a lot of this interior was designed in order to maximize the amount of storage space by minimizing the amount of things that need to take up clutter. As a result, this dashboard, for example, is very minimalist, aggressively so in fact, which is very different from what we've seen from Volvos in the past, which have retained physical buttons to some degree in order to maintain tactility. Instead here, everything has been integrated into this central screen in a very Tesla-like fashion, which means that, again, you get all of your speed, readouts, etc. Everything related to the car lives up here, including this car's view through its ADAS system, through its cameras and sensors. Now, I don't like this because naturally when you drive, you look ahead, not here. And pertinent information, for example, like my blind spot warnings and so on, should be displayed within my line of sight, not somewhere off to the side. In addition to that, because this is a unique system to the EX30, this is newer than what we've seen before from the C40 and other Volvo models which also use Android Automotive. This system does take some degree of getting used to figure out where all the controls are, etc. It all lives in here, which means that you will need about 10 to 20 minutes, in fact, to try and figure out where all of these things are at any given time. That said, however, once you get to grips with the way this thing operates, at least it does operate very smoothly indeed. All of the buttons and all the switches respond very quickly indeed, and at least the graphics here are also absolutely excellent. It's just that, to me, I find that it is a little bit of a shame that this feels very much like an Android tablet rather than something bespoke to Volvo, because ultimately Volvo is a luxury brand, and so you would want an interface and a user experience that speaks to that luxury and to that degree of quality rather than something generic that feels like anything from an Android phone or tablet. Now, onto the compromises that I mentioned earlier. Again, all the controls live in here, which means that, for example, in order to open the glove box, which is in the middle, you press the screen. The fact the glove box is in the middle, however, does mean that it's a bit more accessible to the driver rather than having to reach over for something in the passenger footwell, which is certainly very nice. And of course, if you do have a passenger there, they don't have to move their knees out of the way in order to access this space. And by not having a glove box here, it also means that the front seat can be positioned further forward in order to maximize room in the rear, should you need to. And while the air conditioning controls live in the screen, which is unfortunate regardless of how you want to look at it, at least the controls for the air conditioning vents are still nice and analog, which I appreciate hugely. Talking about that, these air conditioning vents have also been redesigned for the EX30. We haven't seen this in any other Volvo so far. And I have to say, the use of materials in here does make this look and feel a little bit more special. And all of this has managed to be achieved while still maintaining Volvo's pledge towards sustainability and recyclability. For example, this plastic that you see here and also here on the door cards, this is made from recycled plastic, which is why it's been given this lovely texture in order to highlight the fact that this is a sustainable material. The same goes for this lovely blue that you get stretching throughout the cabin, and even on the soft touch materials on the front of the dash as well as on the tops of the doors. All of this is made to be more sustainable. The plastics that are used here for the deployable cup holders, as well as down here for the central storage bin, all of this car is meant to be made to the highest grade of recyclability, which means that this car should also be more sustainable. The same goes for the upholstery for the seats. This is not leather, but it does feel very hard wearing, and the fabric that they use for the rest of the seat also feels very high quality, and in terms of the design and quality, it remains on par with what we've seen from other Volvos, which is certainly very nice. The only issue with all of this is this has also demanded the redesign of the steering wheel. Now, Volvo steering wheels have been known for quite some time for being very intuitive to use, because all the buttons are exactly where you expect them to be and they operate the way you expect them to as well. This steering wheel, however, is not so great because they've decided to integrate more of the controls here while sort of allowing the buttons to do multiple things. So for example, in order to control your ADAS functionality that lives on the left, to control your infotainment that lives on the right, and it's not immediately clear what all of the buttons do. So for example, adjusting the volume requires you using buttons that don't say or don't specifically state that they are for volume, so you have to get used to that. On top of that, the number of stalks in this car have also been reduced because now your wipers live on the left along with your indicator and light controls, whereas your right side stalk is specifically to control your gears. And as a result, it does mean that, for example, if you want to adjust the lights themselves, you have to go into the screen. If you want to adjust the wipers, that's also in the screen. You'll get used to it. Now, what you see up here behind the steering wheel is actually a retina monitor in order to figure out whether or not you're paying attention to the road ahead of you or if you're distracted by the screen on your left. This is very similar to what we've seen before from Smart, for example, which also have these retina tracking thingies. We've also seen this from Chery and other brands which offer you more in terms of semi-autonomy and therefore need to have sensors like this to ensure that you're still paying attention, you haven't fallen asleep at the wheel. Now, beyond that, the rest of this car is still quite practical. With the use of a single Harman Kardon soundbar that is nestled underneath the windscreen. That means that we do not have speaker drivers in the doors, which means that the space here is absolutely massive, big enough for a 1.5 litre size bottle lying down. Even if you want to put things like laptops and so on, you can still fit that here. You have a wireless charging pad up here. You also have this storage tunnel down here where you have your USB-C ports and a little bit more space should you want to, for example, thread cables through and so on. This is very practical indeed. Now, I've already demonstrated to you the deployable cup holders here, which even come with a little phone holder should you want to put it up here, and they can also be reduced if you only want, for example, one cup holder available or none at all. But as a result of this system, you do not have a center armrest, or rather you don't have center armrest storage because that's dedicated to this. There's also storage underneath here which is accessible to the rear passengers. Talking about this, however, this brings me on to another point that I absolutely dislike about this car. Even though I have armrests here, there are no controls for the windows. In order to control the front windows, you use the buttons that are mounted here in the center console. And if you want to try and control the rear windows, you actually have to press a button that allows you to control the rear, and then you control the rear windows. Now, this I think is not necessary. If they put the rear window controls here, that would have been fine, because there is still space here in order for me to control specifically the driver's window. But then again, everything else at least is controlled through this screen, including adjusting the mirrors, etc. Everything is done through here. So maybe this isn't so bad. Maybe this is just Volvo looking at the future and trying to figure out how it is that a younger generation of buyers are going to interact with their cars. Maybe this will work. Maybe I'm too old. But I think I'll need to live with this car a little bit longer to figure that out. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the EX30 does slot beneath the XC40 and C40, which is why life back here is a little bit less spacious. Now, with the front seats at my driving position, about 170 centimeters, you can see I've got a decent amount of knee room and a pretty decent amount of headroom despite the standard fixed panoramic glass roof. But as you can see, the seat bases in this car are mounted a little bit too low, which is why if I'm sat like this, I have very little in terms of under-thigh support. I do need to stretch out a little bit in order to get any degree of support down there, but even then, because this car's relatively small size, means that there isn't that much space for me to reach out into. Now, at least, as I mentioned earlier, because there is only the Harman Kardon soundbar in the front, there are also no speakers back here, which means I get more space here. There's a lot of the same materials that we saw in the front, which means quality remains broadly the same. Controlling the rear windows are done via switches, again mounted in the center, where you also find a couple of USB-C ports. There are no rear air conditioning vents here, which means that, again, you'll have to be reliant on the passengers in the front to channel that air to the rear, although sat back here I am actually quite comfortable. And overall, life back here isn't really all that bad. This car would be suitable for example, young couples or young adults with no children, or even with very young children, because obviously these two outer seats also have ISOFIX mounts, although a bulky rear-facing child seat might be a bit of a stretch in a car like this, even though the doors open quite wide. And then, of course, even if you do have a child seat here, this window line is not perhaps as low as you might like, which means children may not be able to get a view out of there, which means they might get a little bit more car sick, although they are, of course, able to stare out of this lovely glass roof. Now, because this car is big on practicality, as I mentioned, you still have that space here, even though you don't have space down here. But again, Volvo has really thought about how to truly maximize space in here. So for example, in the center console, which I mentioned that you can reach and access from back here, you also have this little bin, which you can use for various different items, and it comes in and out of that center console in order to maximize space. And they've even gone to the effort of actually putting a cute little design here with a little mousse on it, which I think is quite nice. And even though this is ultimately plastic, and a lot of this interior in fact is plastic, at least the majority of the touch points are nice. So this armrest is nice and soft, this is nice and soft, the back of the seats are also nice and soft, and these door handles are solid metal, which is certainly nice when you're spending what I would imagine is in excess of 190,000 ringgit on a compact electric vehicle. Now, this space is very, very busy at the moment, because for about the same price, and of course this is estimated for the time being because this car doesn't launch until September 25th, this car will then compete ultimately with vehicles like the Smart #1, the Zeekr X, as well as various other entrants within that space, as well as other cars from less premium brands like BYD and Chery, which means you do have to ask, does the EX30 have what it takes to be considered, one, a premium car, and two, to justify that expense? Now, the thing about the EX30 is, even though this is Volvo's entry-level model, if you can call it that, it is still ultimately a Volvo, which is why from the moment you get in behind the wheel, there is an immediate sense of quality. And to that extent, again, even though this is a entry-level model from them, it still feels as well built as what you'd expect from the XC90, the S90, the S60, etc. Which means that this is still a very impressive place to be. Compared to vehicles like, say, the Mini, for example, or even other vehicles like the Mercedes-Benz GLA or EQA and so on and so forth, this car feels that it's built to a slightly higher quality, which is again what we've come to expect from Volvo. So much so that even on terrible roads like the ones I'm on right now, you will not hear any squeaks or rattles, or at least you wouldn't unless you've got a bunch of IKEA stuff in the back the way I do, which is why you will still hear a little bit of squeaking. But aside from that, the car itself is very solidly built. And that sense of solidity and quality extends into the way this car drives. There is a polish to the way this car executes everything that it has, everything that it wants to do, and that feels like Volvo quality. The steering wheel, for example, in this car is a little bit lighter than what you might necessarily expect, but it does weight up decently well enough, and it is decently accurate, which means that when you are on twisty roads like this, it does feel very confidence-inspiring to drive. And when you're on the motorway at higher speeds, or even higher speeds, at that point, again, it feels like the car knows what it needs to do, and it conveys a lot of that information back to the driver, which means this is certainly something that you could take over longer distances. Now, talking about longer distances, the Volvo EX30, or at least the all-wheel drive variant that we've got right now, is rated to do about 430 to 450 kilometers or something to that effect on the WLTP cycle. It has a 66-something odd kilowatt-hour battery, and it is DC chargeable at up to 170 kilowatts and AC chargeable at up to 11 kilowatts, although there is also the option for 22 kilowatt AC charging, but it is not clear as to whether or not this will be available in our market. As a result, it does mean that 10 to 80% is achievable in less than half an hour, which means that if you do want to take this car traveling, it shouldn't be too much of an issue at all. Now, beyond that, there is also the question of driving dynamics, although traditionally that's not really what Volvo is known for. But since we've driven vehicles like the C40 and the XC40, we have come to realize that Volvo does have something of a dynamic tilt to it. And so to that end, it is important that this car, the smallest and most accessible Volvo in the lineup, has to also deliver similar qualities. Now, the EX30 is not a car that I would describe as being plush, in the sense that certain plush riding vehicles tend to be a bit softer, a bit more floaty, they tend to isolate the cabin from lumps and bumps. The EX30 doesn't quite do that. Instead, it provides a very feedback-rich driving experience where it feels as if the car is trying to communicate exactly what's happening to the driver, and it does so in a way that doesn't compromise in terms of comfort. I say that because while the ride in this feels very European, while it feels very well damped, at no point does the worst of the road surfaces actually transmit into the cabin. And that creates a situation where you feel confident enough to traverse basically any sort of surfacing. Because even again on roads like this, while the road itself is pockmarked, the surface itself is very, very badly maintained up here. Despite that, at no point do I feel uncomfortable in the car. And because the primary and secondary ride in this car is so very well judged, at no point does it feel like I'm about to lose control, which is what you'd want, again, from a car like this. Now, I know that there will be certain questions when it comes to variants and options and powertrains, but unfortunately, during this preview drive, we weren't really told anything about this. We weren't given any information on this, not even under embargo, and so it does remain a little bit of a mystery. I can, however, confirm that the vehicle I am driving appears to be an all-wheel drive Ultra model, which means that this is the car with dual motors, one in the front, one in the rear, which certainly does help, although primarily it runs the rear motor, only uses the front as and when necessary. But there should be other options available because there was some discussion suggesting that there will be at least 2 or potentially even 3 variants available on sale. That then brings us to the question of pricing, which also was not revealed during this preview drive. Now, from what we can sort of guesstimate, given that this car has to slot in underneath the C40 and the XC40, we expect this to be somewhere in the region of 200 to 250,000 ringgit, given the fact that the higher up vehicle starts at about 280. That would put this in the same line of fire as vehicles like the Mercedes-Benz EQA and EQB, as well as the BMW iX1 and iX2. Although this is ultimately a smaller car, so it's not really an apples to apples comparison. However, compared to those vehicles, I will say that this is certainly targeted to a younger audience, which means that this will most likely compete directly with the Mini. And in that regard, I think that it does have a little bit of an uphill battle. The Mini has image and brand cachet on its side, as well as truly innovative design, which is why we loved it so much when we had it on test. There is a question as to whether or not this car will be able to translate customers looking for that sort of design and dynamic panache to consider a Volvo. I do think that it is something worth considering within the segment, and we certainly look forward to getting more information once this car launches on September 25th, after which the EX30 will be available to drive for all from the 26th onwards at KL base or Sempang Airport in KL, which you are certainly invited to come and attend. But in the meantime, I do think that this car is a strong contender, but you have to be very careful with the sort of people who'd be buying this. I would advise that this is a car targeted primarily to empty nesters or very young families looking for potentially their first electric city car in order to just cart the kids around or to do your usual errand running and so on, because I think that the EX30 is ideal for that. Beyond that, however, you may want something that is a bit more spacious, a bit more practical, and so you might be more interested in vehicles like the Volvo XC40 and C40. But in any case, that concludes our preview drive of the new Volvo EX30. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon so notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care and stay safe.